All right, we're going to get started. Our speaker tonight is Tyler Bain. He is a former participant in our debate that we did last June, which was Bitcoin versus crypto. And this is his first time speaking here. He is the founder of, is it Rocky Mountain Blockchain?
Bitcoin and beer.
Bitcoin and beer. I was close. He founded Bitcoin and beer. He writes for Bitcoin Magazine, and he is an electrical engineer. So you know him, you love him. Give it up for Tyler.
All right. I'm really glad to be here. Obviously, this is my favorite libertarian meetup, and honored that you all would want to attend and hear my spiel. As we talked, I'm an electrical engineer, a professional engineer in the state of Colorado. I specialize on the power grid is my day job, and I'm kind of a Bitcoin enthusiast on the side. I actually went to the School of Mines, so I wish there was a libertarian meetup there when I was attending, or I would have joined. So I missed out on that one. But yeah, thanks for being here. We touch on the basics and go a little deeper. And so if there's any questions at any point, feel free to interrupt. It's probably better if it's interactive. So there's way too much information here. Let's try to get to it. I really just kind of want to talk about Bitcoin as an energy money. And I'm going to talk about how it's an energy money, kind of go into the basics of mining, and how Bitcoin makes certain markets more efficient, and specifically the electric grid, and then talk about some of the misconceptions about its energy consumption. And so really, I think Bitcoin is energy, if you look at some of the first principles. And energy money was put forward by a lot of thinkers through the 1900s, and Henry Ford, Buckminster Fuller, Nikola Tesla, and F.A. Hayek, which we're all probably very familiar with. He had a quote that said, "I don't believe we should ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government, and we can't take it violently. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something that the government cannot stop." And I think that's kind of what Bitcoin is this sly roundabout way. And Henry Ford's quote was, "Under the energy currency system, the standard would be a certain amount of energy exerted for 1 hour equal to $1." But he was just looking at power output, which was energy over time, and an energy value system for all of humanity with watt seconds as work. These uniform energy valuations will replace the world's wildly and varying opinion gambled upon top power system manipulated monetary systems. So I think Bitcoin is this energy currency that a lot of these thinkers were postulating. And so Bitcoin is an energy money. Like what are the advantages? And so you can't really bail out the laws of physics. There isn't overdraft protection on the laws of thermodynamics. You don't need to fractionally reserve the law of conservation of energy. There's no deposit insurance requirements for the joule or the watt. You cannot rehypothecate time and energy, and it's impossible to debase the electron. So I think that's some of the advantages of why an energy money is a superior form of value. Another thing I think that's important to touch on is energy and prosperity. There's not a country or a civilization through history, but there's not a country currently in the world that is energy scarce and prosperous. Energy consumption is essentially synonymous with economic prosperity. The more energy a group of people consume, the more prosperous and economically functional that society is. And so I really think few things are more intrinsically linked to the flourishing of humanity and civilization than energy consumption. If there's abundance, there's prosperity. If there's energy scarcity, there's poverty. So and this chart kind of describes that. If you look at the bottom right, there's no energy poor, rich country. Another important concept I think is energy density, and and kind of how that relates. If you have a monetary unit that is energy, the more dense your monetary system would be, and possibly the more dense your energy system would be. And civilization's always trended from less dense forms of energy to more dense forms of energy. So historically, with the invention of fire, or the discovery of fire, folks burning wood, and then eventually coal and oil and splitting the atom, we've found more and more energy dense sources. And so I think a good example of that is like light, like the electric bulb versus a kerosene lamp. The same amount of energy is can provide quite a bit more illumination. And I think the same concept could possibly hold towards our monetary density. We've moved from shells to precious metals to very dense ones and zeros on a computer, where the value could, is very dense for the amount of matter. So talking about the basics of Bitcoin mining, it's really a transaction validation and verification tool, and it's a peer-to-peer trust mechanism. And so what these miners do is they validate and verify transactions and order them in a way that provides all the blocks, like all the blocks of transactions a timestamp based on this pending mempool of transactions. And so every 10 minutes, a block of transactions is compiled by a specific miner and then published to the network and built upon subsequently by the next set of miners. And so it's really just verifying and validating these transactions and ordering them in a way and then publishing that to the network. And the incentives to do so are transaction fees and the block subsidy. And that block subsidy is part of the initial coin issuance. And so the network itself, all of the coins in issuance were produced by this mining process. And so it's kind of a provable way for the distribution of coins to the network. And then the incentive for a miner to include the transaction in a block is the transaction fee. These people, if I were to send a Bitcoin or a fraction of a Bitcoin, there would be a little bit more Bitcoin included in there to incentivize the miner to include it in a block. And so really what it provides is a mathematically provable, fair consensus mechanism for everybody to agree upon, what balances of Bitcoin lie where. It really secures the network, I guess. And this miner compensation can be visualized. It's the block reward plus which is the issuance plus the transaction fees, and it halves every 4 years, which is roughly about 210,000 blocks. And we're actually due for having this like next April, so just a couple of months we're due for having.
Oh my, come on in.
Yeah, and this is a visualization of the amount of Bitcoin produced per day in terms of actual issuance as part of that total block reward in conjunction with the fees. And so the fees every so often, every 4 years, really half, and then the fees kind of make up for that. This is a visualization of the formula that determines that previous having amount of Bitcoin per block. I think I have something here. Yeah, so it originally 50 Bitcoin were produced every 10 minutes as part of the block reward, and then 4 years later it became 25, and then 12 and a half, and now we're at 6 and a quarter, and here in a couple months it will be 3.125. And so what this is what's happening is programmatically Bitcoin's issuance is diminishing exponentially, and so it's becoming less or more and more scarce, I suppose, as time goes on, and eventually the amount of Bitcoin produced per block here within a decade will be less than 1, every 10 minutes it'll be less than one Bitcoin will be released to the market to trade. And so this is that supply schedule visualized, and this is actually 2022, so we're a little bit further on. I think we're above 19 million coins have been issued, and right now it actually just today it crossed into 93%. So 93% of total coins have been issued and are in circulation. And so over the next 100 years, there's only 7% of the coins left to be distributed out to miners. And so it's a pre-programmed timetable for coin issuance, and again, mathematically, provably fair. And the other thing is it's asymptotically approaching 21 million, which is the hard-coded upper limit of Bitcoin in circulation. This is a Bitcoin miner that was produced in 2017 is when it hit the market, and this is just a rough chart that I put together based on what you would assume it would produce over that same time frame. And if you look at its amount, it follows that same issuance schedule. So it's asymptotically approaching just under 2 Bitcoin is all of this miner will ever produce, which is quite a bit today. But if you look in hindsight, possibly the person who purchased this Bitcoin miner in 2017 would be disappointed at its amount of production. And why would it be limited in production, or why would it asymptotically approach that 2 Bitcoin? In part, it's because of the difficulty adjustment algorithm. And so regardless of how many people are mining or how many computers are pointing at the network, it programmatically adjusts itself to only produce one block of transactions every 10 minutes. So even if the computational power doubles, it's not going to amount to twice the amount of Bitcoin being produced. This difficulty adjustment algorithm will make sure that the coins are issued on that strict schedule of essentially on average every 10 minutes. So it's a feedback loop that ensures steady block and Bitcoin production that self-regulates. This is a chart that shows hash rate versus difficulty, and so the hash rate increases and then the difficulty adjusts to keep that block production steady. And I think what's interesting on this one is essentially on a linear scale, since 2017, the vast majority of hash rate and difficulty has came online, and I think part of that is because of advancements in computational technology and some of the hardware. So Bitcoin was really easy to mine prior to then, I guess, is the takeaway.
When you say hash rate, you mean the hashing power of the entirety of all miners?
Yeah, so the hash rate is just the computational energy that's being put towards the network, and it just cycles on a computer hashing away. And a hash algorithm is really just, it's like a mathematical process and it's a one-way function that can't really be replicated, or can't be reversed, I suppose. So one of the important things I think about that Bitcoin supply that we are looking at, and specifically because of the difficulty adjustment algorithm, is the supply is essentially inelastic. So any other good that we would buy and sell or trade or interact with in a free market has a somewhat elastic supply. So whether it's corn or wheat, if the demand of corn, if more people are wanting to buy corn or wheat, more fields will be planted next year, and eventually the supply will increase. And the same goes with gold. If the price of gold goes up and the signal sent to the market, more people are going to go, gold panning or mining up in the hills and try to extract more of the gold out of so even gold with a theoretically fixed supply has an elastic supply in the market, because people are going to go discover more of that up in Cripple Creek or Blackhawk or wherever. And whereas Bitcoin is programmatically inelastic, the demand and the price has no effect on the quantity. And so I don't think an inelastic good truly existed prior to Bitcoin. Maybe some people can think of some others, but I think supply inelasticity is one of the kind of that was created with Bitcoin. And I think when that supply is so inelastic, that the price becomes a direct function of demand. And so people ask, like, why is the price of Bitcoin up, or why is it down? Well, the answer is because less people are interested in purchasing it today, or more people are interested in purchasing it today, because it really isn't as affected by supply as other goods and services. And because of that, there's this law of diminishing returns on computational power put towards the network in terms of productivity. So if you have more and more miners thrown at the network, it's actually going to produce less Bitcoin per unit of mining computational power, per hash power. You're not going to get as many coins as you would with a different kind of commodity. With a more elastic commodity, maybe it's not as diminishing returns, but so adding that additional hash rate results in smaller increases of coin for every unit of hash rate in existence. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of an interesting dynamic, and this is actually the marginal value of a megawatt hour of energy put towards the Bitcoin network as measured. Kind of cut off. As measured in dollars and Bitcoin. And so the dollar valuation is kind of, I mean, they're both logarithmic charts, so the dollar valuation is still fairly high. But the unit as measured in Bitcoin is actually diminished quite a bit, to the point where it's measured in millibits now. Seven millibits is pretty small, I think, for a megawatt hour. And I think as part of that, it kind of is it's an economics textbook definition of a perfectly competitive market. And I think going back to economics 101, the example of a perfectly competitive market was like a tomato, your local farmer's market buying and selling tomatoes, and maybe every seller has slightly different products, but essentially they're homogenous and everything's identical, assuming that a bunch of different things, I suppose. But if you look at a tomato market at the farmer's market compared to the Bitcoin market, it's not nearly as perfect of competition. The tomato market falls short. So there's a large numbers of buyers and sellers. There's lack of economies of scale, in part because of that marginal. That lack of marginal scalability. It's I don't know. I think it's fairly fascinating. Well-defined property rights and kind of anti-competitive by its nature. And because of that, marginal revenue settles on marginal cost over a long enough time frame in a perfectly competitive market. So only in the short run can a firm make a competitive economic profit. So essentially what that means is all of these miners participating in the Bitcoin ecosystem go belly up really fast and are replaced by someone doing something more effective or more efficient, or has some sort of leverage on their competition, some sort of competitive advantage. And so a lot of these, what it means is that there's not a lot of centralizing forces in the market, and it kind of splinters competition into being a bunch of smaller local regional players, as opposed to some big dominant centralized market making force. It's kind of fascinating. And so over time, Bitcoin mining has evolved onto different hardware, and it used to be just a CPU, which is something your phone has built into it, or just a normal desktop or laptop computer. And that was probably pretty effective in the 2009 to 2010 range, and that's that blue bar over there. And this is the same data. One of them's linearly. The bottom is linear and the top is logarithmic. And so again, you can't really see much of anything on the graph prior to 2017. And some of this ASIC technology became prevalent, but it eventually evolved into graphics processing units, which have higher heat sinks and more computational power, and then field programmable gate arrays, which again just kind of incremented to better efficiencies, using less energy, doing more work, and then application-specific integrated circuits have been pretty dominant for the past decade on the network. And today, I don't know if I have the right, okay, yeah, so today the network's doing, I think, around like 400 to 500 exahash per second, which is 10 to the 18th computations per second, which is incredible. And the state-of-the-art miner off the shelf would be like 10 to the 12th, so terahashes per second. And then I've actually got a miner right here, mining, hashing on the network over Wi-Fi, and it's called a nerd miner, and it does 20 kilohashes per second, so 20,000 hashes per second, and this is just a little CPU miner. And so it's kind of fascinating how quickly the network has evolved. And if y'all want to pass this around, feel free to. It's running off of a battery on Wi-Fi. So I think it's kind of a good example of, I guess, how approachable Bitcoin mining is. It's just a little computer board and an LCD display with a fan, and it's running off of a 5-volt battery. Yeah.
Is that connected to a pool, or are you playing the lottery?
I'm playing the lottery on that one,
Okay.
but it's actually connected to a pool that's doing the lottery for me. And otherwise, you would need a node running, and I don't have a node on my phone, but you could, but I don't. So yeah, it's interesting. It's both. It's a pool and the lottery. So if it had hit a block, we'd celebrate. I would lose it, honestly, if it did, because the odds are very, very small, much smaller than the Powerball. Yeah, it's a great question. I think something that's important to talk about, so that miner is essentially the least efficient thing you can imagine, but it's handheld and it's kind of novel to at least be able to see it. It's running off Wi-Fi, it's in your hand, it's hashing Bitcoin as we speak. It's nothing scary, it's just a computer process. Yeah.
How much is one of those?
One of those, maybe I think it was 50 euros, so whatever the,
Okay.
yeah,
I mean,
some European
Euro's
guy.
pretty close right
Yeah,
now.
I think they're probably parity. So which is incredibly expensive for something that'll never make a profit, but I think it's really, I think it's worthwhile for the, kind of tangible, hands-on. So I think one thing that's really important is that Bitcoin mining is doing more with less every year. And these are also this is the amount of hashes that are occurring on the network per year, the top graph. And then the bottom chart is the joules per terahash, which we saw was 1 trillion hashes per second. And so a joule is equivalent to, a joule is a watt per second. And so it's the energy version of a watt. So if you have a 100-watt light bulb, it would be using 100 joules per second. And so right now, a Bitcoin miner, and actually this is outdated because they've now released a new one, but 2023, the state of the art was 22. Now someone just released one with 19. So 19 joules per trillion computations per second. So if you think about that, a 100-watt light bulb, could barely probably illuminate a portion of this room, whereas, a fifth of that, 19 watts per second can do 1 trillion computations per second, which is kind of unfathomable to think about, and how quickly and so really what's happening is that the Bitcoin network's getting more and more effective and more efficient, almost to the point of absurdity, and it's getting exponentially more efficient so that the energy in the network is improving with Moore's law, the halving protocol. Anyways, it's fascinating. And so this kind of chart proves that, I guess, in a really interesting way. So if you convert hashes per second into flops per second, And a flop is a computer science term for floating point operation. It's essentially a calculation. It's a computer calculation per second. Very similar to a hash, but somewhat different. And so I did the math to convert the two to make them equal. And if you take the top 500 supercomputers published, I'm sure there's some that might not be published, but this is the top, there's a list of the top 500. So like Sandia National Labs, I think the NREL in Golden has a couple. So this is all the top 500 supercomputers in the world charted against the Bitcoin network's computational power. And so essentially, they're not one-to-one, but this allows you to look and see how many of those top 500 supercomputers would it take to attack the Bitcoin network, or at least equal and equivalent computational power as the Bitcoin network. And right now we're at, this is outdated too, it's probably 750,000 times the top 500 supercomputers in the world. So and then again, that's logarithmic, so it doesn't really do it justice. But the last time the top 500 supercomputers could have attacked successfully the Bitcoin network, 51% attack, you've probably heard that term, some of you maybe. That was around 2011 to 2013. And probably the amount of coordination that those top 500 supercomputers to do that, it's essentially impossible. So even then it was impossible, but now it's unfathomable. So the Bitcoin network is very secure, I guess is the takeaway on that slide. I got a lot more here, so let's just try to hammer through it. This is Bitcoin network's efficiency, and I did it on a value efficient. We did energy efficiency per computation on a previous chart. This one's value. So how many dollars were transacted per kilowatt hour that the network used? So you always hear that Bitcoin's inefficient, and this I think disproves that. So a kilowatt hour in Colorado might cost anywhere from 10 to 15 cents. And so Bitcoin in 2022, we don't have the 2023 data yet, but in 2022, Bitcoin transacted $307 per kilowatt hour, which is incredibly economically efficient, I would think, because if it costs 15 cents and you're transacting $300 worth, it's worthwhile usage of energy, I guess would be the correct term. And I thought it would be interesting to compare transaction fees of Bitcoin against other networks. And another important thing to note is that MasterCard, Visa, Discover, American Express, none of us are actually paying that fee. That's the merchant fee that's under the hood for when you slide that card. The person receiving your dollars is paying that. So it's kind of hidden fees, whereas in Bitcoin, the person who sends the Bitcoin pays that amount on average, and it's a little over 1%, 81.25% compared to the leading credit card. And the other interesting thing here is the credit cards aren't final settlement, really. That happens weeks and months later, whereas Bitcoin is final settlement. And this is on chain. This doesn't include Lightning. Lightning's a lot cheaper, a lot faster. Anyways, I digress. Okay, let's talk about Bitcoin and the electric grid, unless anyone has any questions about anything before. No questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I might be missing something really obvious, but as you have aspects of that you're approaching and how much Bitcoin you can get as a miner, what incentivizes people to mine once you hit that asymptote?
Yeah, it would just be fees, because there was two parts of the total reward, which is the issuance, which is what's approaching the peak, but then also the fees. So that's that 1%. So 1% of everything sent is so.
Is it being paid in Bitcoin?
Yeah, the fees are on the network. The fees are underlying in Bitcoin, fractions of a Bitcoin, but yeah, Bitcoin.
But
So-
but that's what I'm saying is like your input for getting that transaction is getting less and less as you approach this asymptote. So you're having to still pay to run your mining system.
Yeah.
But you're getting less. At what point is it not worth it anymore?
All the time, which was kind of what I was talking about with the competitiveness. These big mining companies go belly up in part because they don't do proper planning or diligence, or they don't understand what they're getting into, and so a lot of times they'll fail as a business, these big centralized ones, but the scrappy, smaller, more nimble, more competitive firms are, it's an interesting dynamic. And no, that's a great question, and there's a lot of people that have not found the right answer, in part because some of these like mega conglomerate mining companies have just went under. They're bankrupt. Some of them are bankrupt. Some are doing good. It kind of depends on management and stuff. But
Okay, so on that note, I don't know if you would know, but let's say it's not profitable to mine Bitcoin. Could you pivot to Bitcoin Cash or another project and be
totally.
profitable?
Yeah, there's others, but I think if it's not if you've got hardware where it's not profitable to mine Bitcoin with it, it's unlikely that you'd find another algorithm that would be, or another coin that was using the same algorithm that, it is possible. Some people do that, but yeah, I don't think, if you're not profitable with Bitcoin, you're probably not profitable with much else either, so, yeah.
So, since you showed me on the last previous slide was how many transactions, so it was $307.
Yeah.
And so profit of the miner will be $307 multiplied by 1 person, so it's about $3 per kilowatt. And and we are paying about 15 cents, so it's good investment.
Depending, yeah. If you've got state-of-the-art equipment, then absolutely, and that makes a lot of sense. Like what you said, if the miner's paying only 10 cents a kilowatt hour, but that's also the entire network. So some miners might obviously be paying quite a bit less, and then the network's kind of balances itself out. But yeah, I do think it, in general, is a good investment if you have state-of-the-art hardware. Yeah.
I was going to add a comment to your question about that asymptote. The algorithm, like the last Bitcoin will be issued in 2140, right? So in 117 years or whatever we're at. And I think that was kind of purposeful in the code. Like the hope would be that as you go decade by decade, more actual value is transacted, so the fees begin to offset the Bitcoin reward for the block, and then you're able to be profitable mining just in the fee-based world, and you don't have to worry about Bitcoin itself being rewarded to you in that block.
Yeah, it's great. And yeah, so theoretically the dollar appreciation of the coin itself would offset any reduction in production.
Hopefully by 2140, we're
Yeah, it might not
talking
matter.
dollars.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I still got a lot of slides here, but that was kind of like the general overview of Bitcoin and some of the mechanics and behind it. And then I kind of want to talk about how it interfaces with the electric grid. And feel free to cut me off whenever we're, because I think I could probably keep going all night. So, yeah, one more. Let's hear it.
So you said that Bitcoin is actually energy.
Yeah. Bitcoin is energy.
It's quite interesting situation when we had gold mining. Every coin was gold, so you would be able to take this coin and convert it to gold and use it, for example, in electric equipment or to do something other in chemistry. But right now, when you already have Bitcoins, you cannot convert them straight back to electricity.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point. It's a one-way kind of.
Yes, it's
absolutely.
spent electricity. It's not the way.
Proof of electricity, yeah, but it isn't electricity itself. That's a great point. Kind of a misconception, but yeah, but it isn't energy in the literal sense, but in the I guess figurative. Yeah. No, I like. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification, because you're 100% right. Okay, so let's talk about how Bitcoin and energy interact on the electric grid, specifically. So I guess there's some cracks in the veneer in some of our decarbonization and the greenwashing of our electric grid. Specifically, this is just a couple bullet points that an MIT paper put forward a couple years ago, talking about challenges and opportunities. So as we integrate more solar and wind on the electric grid, there's a projected price volatility and increases in base power costs for the end user. There's going to be reliability concerns. There's possibly significant curtailments, which would include wasted carbon-free generation and lost revenue for these utility entities. There would be more as part of that price volatility, there would be more negative zero and spike pricing, which in my opinion is a market failure by definition. And so essentially these renewable mandates are displacing the nuclear fleet while increasing the cost for the end user, and new nuclear generation remains central to a decarbonization strategy. And so these are not my words, these are words from an MIT working paper a couple years ago. And things have only gotten worse since then, so let's get into it. So as part of that market failure, these are a couple good graphics that we have, and these are sourced from, I think it's the Department of Energy, or it might be FERC, which is the Federal Electric Reliability Commission. So there's 4 different charts here. They're kind of blurry, but this top one is 2012, and then we got 2015, and then over here is 2020, and then 2022 right here in the middle. And so you can kind of see the coloration getting a little darker and a little more pronounced as the years go by. And what this is it's a heat map, and the higher you get up on the scale is the more percentages of the year that are negative and zero pricing on that interconnection for electricity, which I think is kind of a definition of market failure. And here I think this is 25%, and then maybe that's 10, and then like close to 0. So you have in 2022, last year, you have large swaths of the mid-continent interconnection going negative for more than 25% of the year, which is obscene. And you don't see it on the retail side. You're not getting free electricity during quarter of the year, but this is on the wholesale markets. And so the wholesale markets are experiencing a market failure, and it's not widely reported. But in part, that market failure is caused by supply variability, which is trending upwards as we're installing more wind and solar across the US power grid. And so these price frequency charts confirm, which lead to more negative and zero price power intervals, higher than 20%, essentially all the way from North Dakota down to the tip of Texas. And I would argue that this is from malinvestment, from deploying variable generation sources into consumption and transmission infrastructure deserts. So that's kind of what we're yeah.
Is the reason that some of the states don't have anything is they don't have energy markets?
Yes,
yeah.
That's exactly right. And so some of them don't have energy markets, have not actually dove as deep as some of these mid, like down here in specifically Florida and like large portions of WEC. They haven't installed as much solar and wind as these other interconnections, specifically because Duke Energy and Florida Light and Power and some of the other big like investor-owned utilities have a lot of nuclear installed, and so they have a lot of really cheap base load, and they're not letting the markets like dictate wind and solar, and they haven't went down that path of mandates. The other part here is WEC has a ton of federal hydro from WAPA, which is the Western Area Power Authority, and they just have better, I guess, less markets and more cheap baseload power that's carbon free but not wind or solar, if that makes sense. So I think it's malinvestment. And so what could possibly solve this market failure? Well, this is kind of where Bitcoin comes in. And over the past 3 years, it's been fascinating to watch as an energy expert. And I work on the grid here locally in Colorado, and I'm a Bitcoin connoisseur, and so seeing them it's been fascinating. Renewables plus Bitcoin equals a balanced grid, and it's been happening in Texas, which is kind of cool. And the reason it's happening in Texas is because 2 to 3 years ago, China dominated Bitcoin mining. They had probably at least 50, possibly 60% of the mining market was occurring in China due to cheap energy, excess energy, and the Communist Party of China cracked down on it and essentially banned Bitcoin mining. And so because Bitcoin doesn't care about jurisdictions or borders, a lot of these companies and mining entities shipped a lot of their computers to different areas: Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, El Salvador, and specifically Texas. The United States got a lot of it, but Texas got the bulk. And so why is Bitcoin really good for the electric grid, and how can it accommodate those renewable energy assets? Well, it's because of this concept called demand response, which if you're not working on the grid every day, it might not make a lot of sense. But the supply and the demand of the electric grid have to be essentially perfectly balanced 24/7, or you have rolling blackouts and you have blinking lights, and if there's not energy for when that next person turns their light switch on, or turns on their computer, or charges their phone, you have a power shortage, which could have cascading failures. And so the power grid is this constant trying to match supply with demand. And one of the tools they do with that is demand response. And so most loads are not flexible in terms of demand response. Like, you can't turn off a hospital or a school just because there's a shortage of power. The grocery store or the, Independence Institute, like, they're not going to shut off the lights here because there's a shortage of power. It's kind of against their business model. And whereas Bitcoin actually is incentivized to shut off during these times. It has a unique ability to be really flexible in its load and respond to that demand. And so as our grid attempts to shift to more variable generation sources, Bitcoin can spool up and down very quickly, and it appears to be a perfect fit. And so this is from an energy study that was done in Texas, and what they're doing is they're shutting off when that electric grid capacity is met. The Bitcoin miners will elect to shut off and free up some of that excess power for other consumption, and make the grid more easily able to accommodate those peak power times. And this is another little hand drawing showing, the sun typically peaks during the day, the wind peaks around kind of the shoulder hours, and if the load stays constant, Bitcoin can absorb that extra amount of generation from wind and solar. And so this is from the Texas A&M Blockchain and Energy Research Institute or something. Anyways, consortium. And they have a collaboration team that's working with industry to put together a bunch of data. And the unique part about Texas is it has its own grid interconnection called ERCOT. And they're essentially their own little island on the electric grid, and they have their own regulations, their own rules, their own board, their own commission, all this. And so they're trying to provide some really good data especially to Texas A&M. And so you can kind of see it here. This is 3 different scales, but the Bitcoin mining load is the orange-red coloration, and then the price on the system is the blue. And so in times of energy scarcity, because Texas actually has an unregulated market, so that the free market can kind of dictate supply and demand quite a bit better. And so what happens is, when there's a shortage of electricity, the price skyrockets, which incentivizes some people to generate more, and it also incentivizes some of the consumers to shut off to free up some of that capacity. And so you can see when the price spikes down here, the Bitcoin miners actually shut off and go to near zero during those intervals. And so it's trying to absorb some of that cost spike. Yeah.
So previously my calculation showed that we have $3 for every 15 cents spent. So it's 20 times profitable. So why we should shut off our equipment, I believe, quite expensive equipment, when we have 20 times profit?
Because during these interval spikes, instead of instead of 15 cents a kilowatt hour, it'll go up to $10 to $15 a kilowatt hour
Okay.
on the wholesale market. But the retail is buffered from that. So the difference, between the wholesale and retail and the electric markets in Texas, it's very complicated. But essentially, the price goes from, instead of being $15 to $60 a megawatt hour, it can go up to $6,000 a megawatt hour. So the price signals are there, and the miners respond to it. So it's exactly what you're saying. The incentives aren't really there if the electric cost is 15 cents a kilowatt hour. But if that cost goes to $1.50 or $300 a kilowatt, all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense.
So price of electricity is very low.
Yes, in Texas, on the wholesale market. It's not in Colorado on wholesale or retail. And it's not in Texas on the retail side, but on the wholesale it is. So that's the companies interacting with the grid, yeah.
So is that built in the software for mining? To
Yes,
just watch the
yeah,
price of-
it essentially, they have triggers and signals coming right from the grid operators into their equipment, and it'll automatically throttle it down. And a lot of them like to advertise that, so you'll see it on their Twitters. They'll be like, oh, we're in a load control situation, we just shed 90%, it's fascinating to watch for those energy nerds. But really, I think these kind of show it in a couple different charts, but this is a price frequency chart on ERCOT. And so the majority of the time, the price curve on ERCOT is like what you were saying. It doesn't make sense. Keep running, don't shut off. But then, this like 3 to 5% over here on the margins, where the price goes through the roof because of these supply and demand signals on the Texas electric grid, all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense to shut these miners off. And so they're going into these demand response intervals and freeing up capacity for the rest of the grid, which saves Texas and consumers quite a bit. And it's because these miners can be spun up and down, and it increases the load factor. And so what that does is it increases the system infrastructure utilization and revenue for some of these companies that are owning and operating the grid, while minimizing system losses with minimal marginal cost. And so essentially every entity that interacts with the electric grid in Texas is benefiting from these like market mechanisms, as some of those fixed costs of service to operate and run the electric grid are spread across a larger user base. And so it's, just like as of any like market, if there's more consumption but the fixed costs stay the same, those fixed costs are spread across, and it'll reduce the electric bills for Texans, and it already is. It's increasing sales without increasing costs. And so all ratepayers in Texas, whether you're a business, an industry, or a commercial entity, you're benefiting. So the other thing is, a lot of these Bitcoin miners, they're using stranded energy, so they're not even connected to the electric grid at all. A lot of them, we talked about it earlier, but there's like people using landfill methane or used cooking oil, stranded hydroelectric power. There's some miners in Mexico that are using pig waste and cow manure, and then processing that and then extracting the methane out of it and then pumping that through a generator to mine Bitcoin with it. I forget what they call it, but it's like
Bitcoin?
no, it's like shit to coin or something. I don't know. It's something. It's probably not. But other folks here in Colorado, actually, it's really popular because the state of Colorado, in its green energy climate change initiatives, banned the flaring of natural gas or the venting. So you can't flare it or vent it. And so what some of these companies have done is they've captured that natural gas, and instead of just venting or flaring, they'll process it through an electric generator and produce electricity and then produce Bitcoin with it. And so Caruso mining, Upstream Data, there's some other ones, but it's really popular in Colorado. It's also popular in Texas and in North Dakota, but there's a company doing product recovery technology incorporated or something. They're doing waste tires, which Colorado has a huge waste rubber tire problem. Every state does, really. But what they're doing is they're processing that rubber. They're extracting some of the some of the steel core tethers inside of it, and pulling out some of the rubber, and then they're burning the rest, and then taking that energy from burning it and mining Bitcoin with it. So they're getting rid of waste tires and turning it into Bitcoin. We talked about it in Texas, the curtailed renewable energy, and then some thermal energy like produce drying stuff is actually pretty interesting too. So there's a lot of miners that are essentially taking waste heat and turning it into Bitcoin, waste energy. And some fellow put together this chart. His name's Dan, and he thinks eventually Bitcoin will become carbon negative because it will offset some of those things we just talked about. It'll offset enough carbon emissions that it'll actually be carbon negative, and you know, we're all carbon-based beings, so it's kind of, is carbon negativity really, it could be argued whether that's should be our goal or not, but due to some of the methane emissions mitigations, Bitcoin mining could potentially become carbon negative. More Texas and ERCOT information. Right now, the right bar here, we're talking about the curtailed energy. This is solar and wind on the Texas interconnection that is curtailed in 2021. So it's 7.4 terawatt hours of energy was essentially wasted from solar and wind in Texas a couple years ago. And then now, Bitcoin mining actually consumes a similar amount. So you would theoretically have to double Bitcoin mining in Texas to try to make up for the problem of still, and this is with Bitcoin, there's still quite a bit curtailed. So Bitcoin would have to double to try to solve that problem. So I think that's pretty interesting. That right column is a direct waste of energy and a market failure, and Bitcoin could possibly solve that. This is interesting, I guess. Colorado's electric grid has reduced its carbon intensity by quite a bit over the past 10, 15 years. And if you were to read the newspaper, you wouldn't hear that. You would think, oh, it's gotta decarbonize so much more. And in reality, it's almost down 50% from its highs around 2005. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know. I just think some of that stuff is hidden. And in fact, someone did a study on Bitcoin mining, and Bitcoin mining today is around 300 grams per kilowatt hour, which it's actually lower than it's about half. The Bitcoin mining network is half as carbon intensive as the electric grid, which is around 790 grams per kilowatt hour. So I thought that was kind of just interesting. Bitcoin's more renewable than any other country in the world. If you look at some of the Bitcoin Mining Council, which consists of the main corporate entities mining on the Bitcoin network, they have a higher renewable percentage as a source of their energy than any other, than Germany, the European Union, or the United States. So it's really, if anything, it's incentivizing some of this wind and solar, which may not be a good thing. This is some estimations from various different entities, and it would take me an hour to explain this chart, but essentially a lot of the estimations that you see published in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal are drastically overestimating the amount of usage on the network. They ask the question, how much can Bitcoin afford to spend on electricity, and then they assume that's how much is being spent. But as we were talking about earlier, that's clearly not, no profitable or enterprising miner would spend everything that they receive from the network in energy, because it would be a huge waste. So some of these estimates are just monstrous and are not accurate to what the network's consuming. And so these kind of slides show some of that. This one, this is some of my estimations based on physics and economics, kind of a combination of the two estimations, and then these ones on the right summarize that. My estimations are in line with the Cambridge estimations, and this is Bitcoin here, this tiny little circle, and then this is air conditioning use in the United States alone. So it's, you know, it's kind of putting it into comparison, I guess, is, oh yeah, and then this is like TV usage in the United States and fridge in the United States and lighting, and so Bitcoin's essentially, I don't think they show it, but more energy every year is in the United States is put into clothes drying than the global Bitcoin network. So I think that's kind of interesting. If you're worried about Bitcoin's consumption, get a clothesline. Yeah.
I was curious, people that are mining with waste and stranded energy, are they mining in pools? And for the estimates about the network being carbon negative, like where's that coming from? Is it just improved tech, or is it more people like mining the methane?
Yeah, I think it's mostly methane. It's the thought if Bitcoin can expand to a point where it's consuming a lot of the vented and flared methane globally, then that would have methane is, I guess, theoretically worse than CO2, even though over time CH4, which is methane, decays down into CO2 and H2. So I mean, it is kind of like, I don't know, it's all kind of relative, I suppose, but they claim that methane is a worse greenhouse gas by, you know, 10 to 80 times than what CO2 is. And so if Bitcoin can offset some of that methane being released into the atmosphere, then theoretically it would be carbon negative compared to today, or, you know, compared to a base case without Bitcoin, I suppose. So yeah, it's mostly the benefits of methane, I think, is where they're getting that number.
Could that come too from overcapacity wind in Texas, like renewable energy, just mining generally?
Yeah.
They're
Well,
calling-
yeah, and
they're
that would
calling
be like
carbon negative.
that would be zero, I guess, if it was because the way the math is done.
Yeah.
You know, wind and solar doesn't produce carbon. Upstream it does, but at the site. So yeah, I think that's part of it too. This kind of goes into the errors in calculations, and there's a lot of bad assumptions with the economic-based model, which is what we were talking about, like how much can Bitcoin miners afford to spend on electricity? And well, it's a lot, and they're not spending that. So the physics-based calculation is what my numbers here are based on. It's a little more accurate. This is a good graph. It shows energy consumption of Bitcoin mining versus other industries we're familiar with. So Bitcoin mining here is 62 terawatt hours a year. Clothes dryers in the United States, 108. Data centers, which is Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram. And then this is refrigeration in the United States, air conditioning in the United States, marine transport, and then air travel on the far right. So Bitcoin is, for its value, I would say it's not using a terrible amount of electricity compared to other industries. We're pretty much done here. This is Bitcoin versus everything else. It's this tiny little fraction in the whole energy pie. It's kind of a rounding error. And then, okay, yeah.
So, you showed the air transportation, but
Yeah.
where is the road transportation?
Yeah, that's a great question. That wasn't in this figure, but yeah, I would assume it's probably less than marine transportation.
I believe it's much more than air.
Maybe it is.
Much more.
Yeah, maybe it is.
Much more.
That's a great question. I don't really have a good estimation on that one. Maybe it's.
State the question. I can't hear the question.
The question was where we've got aviation and marine transportation, and then what would be road transportation yearly consumption. I don't know a good ballpark number for that. I don't know. Maybe it's more. Maybe it's less. Maybe it's twice as much. I don't know. Somewhere in there. It's probably more than tumble dryers. That's not as good. Okay, so this just kind of compares the Bitcoin network to the dollar, and so, you know, Bitcoin is kind of a free and open source exchange of goods, like a free market exchange of goods and services for Bitcoin. People elect to use it. No one's forced to use it. Energy is used in the mining process, in the the upkeep of the network, but it's because of its use, like valuable goods and services are produced and exchanged. And then I think the petrodollar system is kind of a contrasting to it, and there's a government monopoly on that system, and the petrodollar system through our taxes funds the military industrial complex, and allows overtaxation, and then also is easily the supply is easily expanded and manipulated, causing inflation, which is kind of an insidious, illegal, hidden taxation. And so I think Bitcoin kind of inherently isn't as affected by some of those things. So there's kind of an interesting graphic between it. But I think in conclusion, Bitcoin might lead us to an abundant energy future, and it's increasingly likely that Bitcoin will play an integral role in incentivizing the decentralization of our energy system, and kind of increasing liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness for anybody that chooses to use it. So it's a catalyzing renaissance of a monetary system that would also likely translate into our energy system. So thanks y'all. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So do you expect the energy usage of Bitcoin mining to drop a little once the last Bitcoin's been mined, and that the miners are only getting fees, or
possibly, yeah, because the incentive to hunt after those newly created coins would be gone. So you would think theoretically it'll level out somewhere, but at the same time we've seen
But you still need to
yeah.
you still need to hash enormous amounts of
you would think
to do
both.
the feed.
But I think the trick is that eventually the hardware will kind of stop getting as effective, and so once that kind of balances out and the fees overtake the supply issuance, then theoretically, the energy supply or the energy consumed on the network would kind of find an equilibrium over time. As of right now, it's growing though as more users are connecting into it. Not because of that, but because of the price appreciation. Yeah.
So my question was regarding different part of energy. Since even this device produces not only Bitcoin but also produces heat and electricity.
Heat and Bitcoin. Yep, it's a byproduct.
Yes, heat and Bitcoin. So how do we use that extra heat in any profitable way?
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of people that are doing that, and I kind of touched on it, but just briefly. But some folks in Colorado, cold weather climates, they're heating their home with that excess heat. Other people are heating greenhouses. There's a fellow in the Bitcoin space that's been doing hot water heaters with Bitcoin miners submerged and doing like a thermodynamic process to have a hot water heater that produces Bitcoin and hot water. So yeah, there's that wasted heat, or it doesn't have to be wasted heat energy. It can be used twice. So the energy is used to produce Bitcoin and then also to heat a home or a greenhouse or the hot water, because space heating and water heating are two of the biggest energy consumption sources of energy consumption in a home, especially during the winter. So yeah, no, people are doing that for sure.
You can buy an S9 for like $90 and heat my garage.
Yeah, maybe less.
With it, yeah.
Sweet.
Last question.
Web miner.
Anybody have a last question?
Going once.
That ceiling, like the Bitcoin ceiling, is
Totally.
there any chance that gets increased and they say, no, we're gonna up it?
Yeah, so if someone were to do that, that wouldn't be Bitcoin anymore.
Okay.
So it's kind of like like the rules of chess or the rules of baseball. Well, if there's someone could make 4 outs and or 4 strikes, you're out of the old ball game. Well, then you're not really playing baseball, and it's kind of a, I guess that's best. It's a consensus, but yeah, if you were to change the rules drastically enough, it's no longer the same game, and people have done that. There's Bitcoins right now in existence. Bitcoin, they're not, but they're like an alteration of it, and yeah, those exist, but no one really uses them, and they're not really that valuable. So yeah.
That's our talk. Give it up for Tyler. Thank you.